number 5, now we're getting into more traditional stuff that you guys know about. Again, if you do those first 4, we're going to be in pretty good shape in terms of flexibility and mobility. But a lot of us, the house is already on fire. And so we need some additional foam rolling and even some static stretching. Now, I've been very vocal in the past about static stretching, but it's not that I'm against it. In fact, if you buy any of my programs, they all incorporate some static stretching. But I put it as optional, and I'll explain why in a second. But the big thing is I think people overdo it here. I think it got so popular in the early 2000s that even when I was first starting to get certifications around like 2009, 2010, it was still like very, static stretch heavy. And I think people became reliant on that. And then more and more studies came out and it's like, well, it doesn't prevent injuries and it doesn't improve performance. And the studies just don't support it. But my intuition and my experience tells me that it still has its place. I just don't want people to become reliant on it. So I make it optional because not everybody needs it. Once you build a certain amount of flexibility, you should probably move on. Let's maintain that and let's move on to other qualities, right? We don't need to all be able to do the splits. Is it going to be detrimental? Well, maybe. We don't know, because what do we know about flexibility improvements through static stretching? There's a few studies that would suggest that it is happening at the muscular level, increased fascicle length. Or most studies show that actually you're not changing fascicle length with static stretching. It's mostly nervous system. It's stretch tolerance. It's decreasing things like the stretch reflex. Now, the stretch reflex, what could go wrong there? Well, it's a protective mechanism, right? When my foot hits the ground and I start to lengthen a muscle, particularly lengthening at high speeds, I want that protective mechanism to go, hey, contract the muscle to provide stability for the joints and then to make my next movement more explosive. But that is a protective strategy that the body naturally wants in place. And we know that we are dampening, or should I say maybe you're not inhibiting, because the stretch reflex is still there, but you're essentially pushing it to a lower level, desensitizing. That's the word that I'm looking for. We're desensitizing the stretch reflex, and you're pushing it to a lower level so that when you go into these stretches, your stretch reflex doesn't kick on and stop you right away. Because if that stretch reflex is really sensitive, it stops you. And so to be able to go deeper into your stretches, it starts to desensitize that. So now that stretch reflex might not kick on until I'm in a way lower position. But like a game like basketball is played in very, minimal joint angles, like minimal knee angles when I'm sprinting and when I'm cutting. So not enough flexibility can hinder you from getting into your sport-specific positions. So that in itself can cause injury, in my opinion. That's not supported by the research. But in my opinion, if you can't drop into all the necessary positions and you don't have all the necessary positions that just a mobile, flexible human should have, then I think personally that could increase risk of injury. If we take that too far, who are we robbing? We're robbing Peter to pay Paul somewhere. What are we doing? We don't fully know yet. But I would guess it has mostly something to do with desensitization of the stretch reflex. Or another change at the muscular level could be changes in pronation angle. So you're actually making structural changes at the muscular level through full range of motion strength training, especially, and then possibly some research would suggest through stretching. And so yes, we want enough, but going too far, I just don't think that it's necessary. And then we have plenty of research showing that hypermobility, too much mobility, is a significant increased risk of injury, ACL tears and ligament and joint issues. So I like to play that middle ground. And then the other thing is let's just logically take a step back and look at your sport and go, of the 50 most durable players in my sport, who played at a high level for a really long time, how flexible were they? Right? We don't always want to look at an individual, not one person or two people, and go, wow, they're flexible, so I got to be flexible. You want to look at across 50, 100 people and go, of the top 50 most durable NBA players, how many of them were really, really flexible? And the answer is not many. I can think of maybe one or two guys that were like pretty flexible. Outside of that, like all of them, they stretch, but they weren't like actively pushing for a ton of range of motion. They weren't able to do the splits, none of that. So could you survive? Could you do the splits and still survive? I think, yeah, possibly, but I just don't think that across the most durable players, we see that that's a commonality. Like we could cherry pick and find the one athlete or the two guys that could do the splits or come close to it. What about the other 48 or 49 who could not do that? Yeah, I'm going to go with the commonalities and with the research and say, maybe I need adequate and not too much. Anyways, that's why I've been vocal about static stretching, is I just want people to understand that there's negatives and there's positives, just like with anything. But there's no such thing as free lunch in the human body. Now, one of the things with static stretching is ideally we're going to have an individualized assessment to find out, okay, what areas actually need lengthening and what areas feel tight because they're already over lengthened. That's a very common thing. Not everybody can get an assessment, and that's fine. And so with our online programming, that's why I make it optional. If you get up out of that stretch and you feel grindy joints and you feel like something else just tightened up, like it's called protective tightness. Like one muscle is protecting another area. And then as soon as you lengthen that muscle, now that other area doesn't have that stability that it was looking for. And now your body's more exposed. You just got rid of a compensation that was there for a reason. That compensation was protecting you. So there's a lot of those areas, like a muscle is weak and therefore another muscle is tightening up to protect it. Well, we didn't need static stretching. We just needed strengthening and it all would have loosened up. The other scenario is positional stuff like muscles. We've talked about this plenty of times. Muscles are prisoner to the joint position. So if my pelvis is in a certain position, and yes, some anterior tilt is totally normal, but we also have studies showing that it does, an excessive anterior tilt does lengthen the hamstrings. So we do have longer hamstrings, and that can cause tightness. And so if you have somebody with recurring hamstring strains over and over again, and they're in that position, then we know, hey, I don't want to stretch you. You have over lengthened hamstrings, and that's why you feel tight, because it's like pulling, it's like a band, just like pulling it tighter and tighter and tighter. You're making the problem worse. Well, we could strengthen that hamstring, and we could strengthen the abdominals and the obliques and the adductors and improve our breathing and get that pelvis into a better resting position, which would decrease the hamstring tension. And it would also simultaneously decrease the hip flexor tension. So that's where it gets really messy, is like telling somebody that they got to do these specific stretches. It doesn't always work. Now, if you do the stretch and you feel better, great. Awesome. Let's keep doing it. But if you do the stretch and like a lot of people, they do it, they get out of it, they actually feel worse afterwards. Or they tighten up more the next day. Or your movement quality just decreased because of these stretches. Well, hey, the problem isn't stretching. The problem is something else. It's probably more strength related. Let's build some full body strength and let's see if it takes care of our flexibility issue. The other thing with flexibility is I think some people get confused because they're just doing it wrong. They're not doing enough time under tension. So we all know, like, hey, if I want to build a muscle, I need some time under tension. I wouldn't go like really intense for one repetition to build the most amount of muscle, right? I would probably go in the 6 to 15 range, more time under tension, a little bit higher volume, and that would make an actual change in the muscle. Well, the same thing is true with static stretching. I think people can go a full minute or 2 minutes and do that every day and accumulate more total time under tension at a 7 out of 10 discomfort, right? So getting a stretch where you're like, I do feel it, but I'm not pushing really hard, and take that for longer. Whereas most people go maximal end range, they go to a point where they're like 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10 discomfort, and then they hold that for like 15 seconds and they move on. It's not enough time under tension, but your nervous system actually usually revolts. It goes the opposite direction, because when you're in a really stressful position and your body's like, dude, you're going to injure me being here, it's going to increase the protective tensioning. It's going to increase the resting tone. So a lot of times people go too hard and it makes your nervous system not trust that position. So I would go a little bit lighter and I would go a little bit longer and more frequently and see if that starts to loosen some things up. Now, what we do know over and over again in the research is that stretching's not permanent. So, just because I'm lengthening my groin doesn't mean that 3 weeks later, my groin is still going to be more flexible than when I started. A lot of times you're just as tight if you take some time off. But what it does a great job of is providing a window. It's the same thing as foam rolling. Foam rolling and static stretching provide us a window, whether that's a window in the session where I can now train in deeper positions, or a window within a couple weeks, right? Where I'm consistently doing this every day. After a couple weeks, maybe after 3 weeks, 4 weeks, you actually start to really improve that range of motion. And now you can train, you can strengthen through a full range of motion. And that's where it gets cemented, right? We've talked about this a lot, so I'm not going to harp on this too much. But the studies show that that's where it becomes much more long-term, is when we actually get strong in these positions. So static stretching can be very beneficial. It can be harmful, right? Just like anything, there's pros and cons. If it feels right, then I think it's probably a good idea for you to do it. But I don't think that you need to build a crazy amount of flexibility through static stretching. And, whether we are, like I said before, robbing Peter to pay Paul and there's detrimental effects, or we're just competing for time, right? There's a point of diminishing returns where you can no longer use it in the sport. And I say build all the necessary ranges of motion that you need in the sport, plus some. Build a buffer. And outside of that, you're not going to need a lot more. And so at some point, we're just competing in terms of time. Or you see the case of somebody's fighting hard to do the splits and they strain muscles. And now we're actually interfering with our career because of injuries chasing something that didn't have a very high return. So that's where I stand on that.